The Abysmal Horror by B. Wallis. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Warren Kati. The Abysmal Horror, Section 1. Batson was sitting on one of those infernal benches common to all English seaside resorts, long, hard contrivances built out of 1x4 battens, painted brown or green. The color never varies, the architecture seldom. The seats and backs are built without the slightest relation to the anatomy of the human figure. However, tradition has proclaimed that thus were they ever made, and thus shall they ever be. Therefore, as the proper procedure of a holiday-making Briton, he was decently enduring the discomfort of one. It was past midnight, and, except for a few courting couples and himself, the esplanade was deserted. But Batson had to make the most of his fortnight of freedom. 1 week had already vanished, and in 7 days he must return to London and the musty office where he had spent 9 hours a day for the last 11 years, entering up ledgers at a salary of 35 shillings a week. By exhibiting a total disregard of his own tastes, comfort, and health, he had risen to and retained this billet. He realized his good fortune and was to a large extent contented. Nevertheless, there were moments when he sensed that life had many high roads and bypaths which offered greater value for the barter of a soul, and that was just what he was thinking as he gazed absently over the black water. The night was warm, and the scene was monotonously restful. Probably in a little while he would have dozed. But fate decided that he should be one of the few to witness the arrival of the most momentous visitor this planet had ever known. It was just a flash, a streak of brilliant light, and it was gone. It came into view high over the black water, and, rushing in an arc, passed overhead, speeding inland. It appeared to him to be about equal to the size of the full moon, but as his eye followed its course, he had the impression that it had become much larger before the retina lost the impression of that lightning-like stab. "Crikey!" exclaimed Batson in an awed tone. "That's a whopper!" Once in his irresponsible youth, he was now 26 years old, he had attended a short course of lectures upon astronomy at the Polytechnic. He had been deeply interested, for in him were the seeds, though he never knew it, of that divine fire we fatuously label imagination. The monotony, the deadly poison of a meager assured sufficiency, had stifled the growth and deprived him of the energy necessary to feed it. Yet shreds of knowledge, gleams of that lost paradise remained dormant within him, and now he knew that, in a few hours, many millions would be reading of what he had been the favored observer, for he realized that this was no ordinary visitor, and a certain emotion at his own eminence in being able to discount the morning papers. They did not arrive until the 10 train, with their account of the big meteor, afforded him great satisfaction as he sauntered back to the boarding-house. And that was the commencement of the strange and disastrous happenings which beset the world so shortly. Possibly a few hundred persons of the British Isles shared with him the doubtful privilege of witnessing the arrival of this unique visitor, but certainly not one had thought of the horror which it brought with it. It was a meteor, sure enough, but of enormous proportion, far and away the largest humanity has any record of, so large that it might rank as a baby planet, one of those small dark bodies with which space is thought to be profusely peppered, and which are invisible until they get well within the grasp of our sun. Of course, on that particular morning, Batson overslept and arrived at the dining room a good 20 minutes later than his fellow boarders. They appeared to be greatly excited, and their interest was centered around a half a dozen copies of the Bright Sea Advertiser. "Here, Batson," cried an acquaintance, Dyke of Wakefield and Ruggles. "Have a squint at this. You know a bit about these things, don't you?" And he handed him the sheet, which Batson at once saw was a special, run out by the enterprising editor. Where Dyke had gleaned the knowledge of his early studies he could not say. However, he was flattered by the publicity of the appeal and the sudden arrest of the clatter as all eyes were turned in his direction. "Well, not a great deal. An amateur, you know," replied Batson modestly as he scanned the bold type and, suppressing his amazement, read, "Giant meteor falls near Romney. Diameter 300 feet. Countryside on fire. Dozen farms vanish." "Ah, I thought so," said he with deliberation. "Thought what?" queried Dykes impatiently. "That something like this would happen," said Batson, shaking his head gravely. "When I saw that big chap go sailing by last night." "You saw it? Where? What was it like?" cried a dozen eager listeners. "Oh, I happened to be out late, doing a little star charting, you know, when this great brute came swinging along. Rushing he was, big as a house, and all a mass of red flames. I guessed by the line it was going it would fall somewhere around Romney way, and I tell you I felt mighty glad I wasn't living there. It was a magnificent sight. Likely the world will never see such another. You missed something," he added in lordly regret. During the morning the strain upon his inventive faculties was exhaustive, though a hasty scanning of the Advertiser gave him some pointers. The editor was a talented man in this direction, and had let himself go. Not often had a local sheet the chance to forestall the great dailies. These, when they arrived, were simply a mass of huge flaring headliners of the most startling nature, and the matter which they headed warranted the display, for it transpired that the descent of this unique arrival had been accompanied by a serious loss of life and destruction of property. It had apparently descended in the curve of a speeding missile a few hundred yards south of the village of Rumford. There torn a gash in the ground 100 feet in depth and many long, and from there it had bounced like a rubber ball for a half-mile, erasing a third of the hamlet before rising clear of the balance, alighting again, dented another hole in the countryside, snuffing out a large farm in the act, and then, in decreasing leaps, had covered another 2 miles of farmland, leaving a trail of awful destruction in its wake preliminary to ceasing its activities. It now reposed, a vast, glowing, incandescent ball in the extensive Romney marshes, which, in flat, water-sogged wastes, extend into the Thames estuary. So far as a hasty survey could be accurate, over 500 persons had perished in this disastrous landing. Of this appalling number, the greater proportion had utterly vanished, and the remainder were merely charred remnants burnt to a cinder by the intense heat of the passing monster. Among these latter were the occupants of the celebrated Wivenworth Hall, the seat of 20 generations of Wivens. The direct and last representative, with his entire family, had perished, and the stately Tudor pile had in a second become a molten furnace in the fiery breath of the giant, as it almost brushed the walls in passing. Even now, as it lay, with 1/4 of its vast bulk buried, it was impossible to approach within a radius of a couple of miles, and already, for that space, every house, every blade of grass, and every vestige of inflammable material had been consumed, and beyond this radius fires were hourly breaking out, the tremendous and sustained heat rapidly drying to tinder an ever-increasing area. It was estimated to be 300 to 400 feet in diameter. All London was flocking to the spot, and the railroads in that district had suspended their set schedules to send everything on wheels packed with excursionists of the vicinity. Autos, aeroplanes, ancient four-horse charabancs, costers with their mokes, on wings, on foot, on wheels, a vast multitude were pouring that way. Business had entirely ceased. Workers in offices, stores, factories, and docks simply laid down their tools and joined the black tide. A mania had taken possession of the populace to view this giant arrival from out of the depths of uncharted space. The impact of its first alighting had been distinctly felt in the metropolis. The severity of the blow and the tremendous crash which accompanied it were at first thought to be of a subterranean nature, and occasioned much alarm. But telephonic news from the neighborhood of the descent soon set the presses whirling, and the specials broadcast the bare facts. The excitement became intense, and great crowds flocked the streets of the city. Primrose Hill and the heights at Highgate and Hampstead were black with an eager, seething mass of humanity striving to obtain a view of the monster, for it was very clearly visible from these points as a brilliant, rose-tinted, glowing disk, which threw its radiance even upon the watchers themselves, and paled the star-spangled dome far beyond them. An hour before dawn the main arteries leading to the marshes were packed tight with a jostling throng, and daylight witnessed a veritable stampede of unheard-of proportions in progress. Hour by hour, the infection of that endless, hastening stream spread to the more phlegmatic, until they, too, found the urge irresistible. London was fast emptying. Commerce had ceased as it had not ceased since the days of the Great Plague. The wildest rumors and predictions were in circulation, proclaimed and accepted with conviction. The heat would destroy the city itself. The shock had deflected the path of our planet, and we should be engulfed by the sun, and so forth. The authorities, alarmed at the total disruption of commerce, had endeavored to stem the tide by aid of police and military, but, short of actual warfare, no human efforts could prevail. For 2 days this frenzy of unreasonable curiosity raged. Then such prosaic matters as a scarcity of bread, meat, coal, and the exposure to the elements of those earlier multitudes unable to force their return, asserted themselves. For the most sublime events cannot maintain their hold when confronted by hunger and exposure. In those first 2 days there was no returning. Hundreds of thousands had therefore been compelled to remain in the vicinity of the marshes, or move further abroad. But now, strong in numbers and desperation, these great masses drove their weight against the incoming stream, and slowly brought them first to a standstill and then to a retreat. Ever increasing in weight by a succession of frontal waves, retreating to save their lives, the tide turned and rolled citywards. By the third evening, London had refilled, and the great stampede was over, to be ever remembered as one of the most inexplicable manias which humanity has experienced. End of section 1. Section 2 of The Abysmal Horror by B. Wallis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 2. A week later, Men still read the morning papers with a pleased interest, noting the fresh data of the scientific bodies, minutely watching it with the complacency of parents observing the growth of their progeny. And dense throngs from all over the country still streamed to view in awe the glowing giant, which now had appreciably cooled and was in the dull red stage, although it was even yet unapproachable within half a mile. For the last few days a providential spell of wet weather had held further conflagrations in check, and it was hoped that danger from this source was no longer to be apprehended. Batson, on his return to town, he refused to shorten his stay at Brightsea by a single day, made a Sunday excursion to the spot. He returned with his belief in the stability of our solar system badly wrecked. It certainly was an incredibly huge mass viewed on those flat marshes, and it entailed a strenuous effort of the imagination to picture the thing hurtling through space and eventually, after who could say how many years rudderless traveling, coming to rest not 30 minutes from his own doorstep. A good 300 feet it reared its visible bulk aloft. Nearly a fourth was hidden deep in the muck of the marshes. Its height, weight, and composition were already common knowledge, and, so far as the latter went, differed only in quality from a similar-sized section of our own planet, radium, gold, and nickel being largely in excess. Even on his visit 2 weeks after its descent, it was still faintly red in the daylight and distinctly luminous in the night, and the heat at half a mile was quite perceptible. "Loomy, she's a whopper, all right. To think I was the first to spot her." He dwelt for some time with much satisfaction upon the thought, though its veracity was not acknowledged by the correspondence the press received from a host of individuals with identical claims. He returned to town, a thoughtful and expanded being. He could not detach himself from the majesty and awe of that lonely flight through cold, dark, incalculable space. Expert opinion was veering to the belief, however, that this was no wanderer of lengthy, in light years, duration, but rather was it more probable that, due to some stupendous convulsion, a fragment had been torn from some distant unknown world and hurled beyond the gravitational radius of its parent, and had, under the attraction of other bodies, continued its course until, passing close to our planet, it had been captured and forced to alight. That this should be its origin entailed, of course, an almost endless chain of miracles, but then so does the daily existence of untold heavenly bodies. In its flight through the lower strata of our atmosphere, it is a certainty that it encircled our world at least once, and probably several times at a great distance. It became plastic from the intense heat generated by the friction, and, whatever its previous form, was molded into its present globular shape. This transformation would take place probably between 10 and 20 miles from the Earth's surface, or, rather, it would commence then and culminate at a somewhat lesser height. And so, having learned all that the man in the street could readily assimilate, the great common-sense public later on shelved the incident and returned to its daily menu of crime and divorce. Some 2 months after this unique landing, our friend Batson, one Sunday, was stretched full length in the shade of a patch of gorse on Hampstead Heath. It was the last week in July, and the day was so sultry that even a most atrocious and minutely detailed murder was perused by him without much satisfaction. The paper he held was one of the great weekly editions, which appear to be in wireless connection with every square mile of land and water from pole to pole. it is immaterial that he was smoking a cheap and nasty imitation Egyptian cigarette. Also, that short paragraphs invariably diverted his attention from the more stately solid columns. In one of these digressions, his eye alighted upon the following: Herzegovina, Bosnia. A most extraordinary state of panic exists in the hamlet of Gorovica, the inhabitants of which are en masse migrating. The reason being, they assert, the presence in the neighboring mountains of an unknown plant growth which is possessed of locomotory powers and predatory activities. They maintain that 2 of their number have already fallen victims to this strange vegetation, and others have had narrow escapes. While most probably the fatalities are due to entirely natural causes, exaggerated by ignorance and superstition, yet the affair has attracted considerable attention, and the authorities have instituted an investigation. Gorovica lies 35 miles northeast of the capital. The country is wild and rugged in the extreme. Education is practically non-existent. "Ignorance lot, I reckon," said Batson aloud. "Awful bosh. Queer, though, a whole village moving out. People like that don't leave home for nothing." Unaccountably, his mind reverted to that paragraph many times during the afternoon. On that very day, 2 men, separated by many thousand miles, had barely escaped with their lives from dangers every whit as incredible as the item that Batson had read, and long into that night they sat, relating to wondering and sympathetic friends their strange experiences. One, a Sicilian fisherman, told with many crossings and expressions of gratitude to the saints a story of being off a long rocky point laying out his lines for the fish, which at low water swarmed there. He had cast out his lines, and was waiting for the turn of the tide to test the presence of the shoal, as then the catch was the most sure. Waiting, he had drowsed in the stern of the boat, drowsed until he was aroused by a gentle rustling on the outside of the craft, as though some object was passing underneath. Thinking that a porpoise might be beneath the keel, engaged in scraping off certain marine parasites, as is their occasional fashion, he leaned over the side, mildly curious. But all he could see was a mass of what he took at first to be a species of large rope-like seaweed. Yet the dull green color and stout build of the stems and fronds were unfamiliar to him, and attracted his attention. He described the fronds as being as long as his arm, and nearly as thick, widening as they left the parent stem, and with extremities which seemed to be curiously involved series of folds. There was something fleshy and morbid in their appearance, which was enhanced by their color, a dull, oily green. And as he gazed at the thick, smooth stems, a feeling of revulsion he could neither describe nor explain came upon him. For a moment he gazed wonderingly. There appeared to be a mass of it, and only around the boat. Then he became aware that it was not the ripple on the water that was imparting a semblance of movement to the growth. It was a movement originating in its own mass. The rope-like stems were slowly twisting and thrusting their visible lengths from one side to another, and the fronds, too, appeared to be alternatingly retracting and elongating, though on the whole the motion drove the mass closer to the boat. Beyond, he caught sight of 2 more similar masses, which he had not previously noted. There was something very disagreeable in the sight and proximity of this stuff. Of course, Giuseppe was merely a poor, uneducated fisherman, and could not express fully to his audience the complex mixture of curiosity and dawning distrust which possessed him at the time. But suddenly his curiosity vanished, and his distrust changed to fear, as he realized that every stem and frond were moving in toward the boat, and a great number already alongside were gently tapping and striking at the planking, even raising their convolutions above the surface to do so. It was as though they were intelligently examining the craft. Then the fisherman, thoroughly alarmed, relinquished his role of passive observer. "Madre adios! I made one quick jump for the oars, but something tripped me and I fell all in a heap to the bottom. My leg felt as though a steel trap had snapped on it. I turn my head as I fall. Then I see what it is that has hold of my leg, and I know great fear." Which, undoubtedly, he did. For from the opposite side to which he had been facing, a dull, oily green rope extended its length over the gunwale and to his leg, upon which it had taken a turn around and back on to itself. It was perhaps no more than an inch thick, but it was as rigid as a wire cable, and its grip on his leg felt like the bite of iron. 2 fronds, probably attached to this stem, had half their length above the side, and their blunt thick tips were in motion, and had opened out in a rosette shape, exposing a wide orifice encircled by a series of little discs, somewhat similar to these upon the limb of an octopus. Giuseppe was a powerfully built man, and just then a very desperate one, for he felt that the gripping cable was dragging him to the side, and at that moment another cable came softly sliding over the gunwale. By great good fortune, the long, heavy knife, which these men usually carry to eviscerate the larger of their catch, was lying within his reach. Without a second's thought, he seized this and, twisting round, slashed with all his strength down on the gripping length. It was likely a blow which would have severed a man's head from his body, yet he had to repeat it before he attained his release, and the greater part whipped back with a whang like a huge rubber band. 2 more lightning strokes he made at the other cable, and still another which had arisen while he was freeing himself. These invaders he sliced apart with a single stroke for each. Then, seizing the sculls, he thrust them over and pulled with all his frantic might straight out to sea. Whether this move was unexpected, or whether these injured strands had their origin all in one individual mass, and the strange thing was temporarily vanquished, Giuseppe could not say, but the fact remains that there was no further opposition to his progress. The mutilated ends he swung overboard with the tip of his knife, when he had placed a good mile between himself and the scene of the attack. This, reduced to the essentials, was the narrative of Giuseppe, fisherman of Bajaccio, Sicily. Now we turn to the strange experience of Angus McAllister, shepherd of Ardgavon in western Argyllshire. Angus, though a rigid upholder and attendant of the U.P. Church, was well known to be no stranger to the wee drap that cheers, and also inebriates. Therefore, at the Bonnie Charlie that night, while all were attentive listeners, there were many who more or less openly envied him the condition which they presumed had inspired his narrative, but others with Celtic leanings to the supernormal listened enthralled. Anyway, Angus was emphatic in his statement that the sheep might trot before he would set foot again in that ungodly hill Ben Craich. It was there that very afternoon he had been seeking some missing members of his charge. A black wild mass is Ben Craich, great precipices dropping bare and sheer to dark, lonely pools, low bushes, dwarfed and ungraceful, heather, and scrawny masses of unfruitful briars formed the sole vegetation to be found in all its grim 3,000 feet. Near the summit, Angus came upon a couple of the wanderers, but they were through with wandering, and they lay almost covered by a tangled mass of dried, withered-looking stems. They lay at the foot of the northern precipice, which descends in one great step right from the summit for 500 feet to the pool known as Ben's Cup. This is simply seepage held in check by a ridge of debris fallen ages gone by from above. The pool is deep but small in area, barely half an acre in extent. Along its edges, a dense growth of stunted scrub and trailing climbers secure their sustenance. Near the center of a patch of these latter lay the two animals. That they were defunct was obvious, for their hide and flesh had been stripped from their underparts, giving them a singularly shriveled, emaciated appearance. Angus was naturally both astonished and wrathful, as it was now some years since he had shot the last pair of golden eagles, and the district had been free of such marauders. Angus gave vent to several hearty Gaelic and Anglo-Saxon expletives, for all that he attended the kirk so regularly. Then a fact regarding the mutilated corpses caught his attention, and he stopped to consider its bearing upon the assassins. For the eyes in both remained untouched, and eagles, like all birds of prey, apparently regard these organs as an epicure does his lark's tongues on toast. The shepherd drew nearer and stepped into what he took, unheeding, to be simply the dead stems of a clump of brambles. As he forced his way through the tangle, it seemed to him, he thought of this afterwards, that his passage communicated a tremulous motion to the whole mass. He leaned over the nearest carcass and, using his left hand, took hold of a foreleg, intending to raise the body to examine it more closely. Then the thing happened which accounted for the condition of his coat and arm that night. As he gripped and lugged at the leg, a thin stem flicked upward and fell lightly across his wrist, and, whipping over it very perceptibly, tightened itself to form a clasping bracelet. The incident was to Angus merely the rebound of a pliant stem from his step. Impatiently he drew his hand back to free it, but his hand went back not 1/3 of the space the energy expended should have taken it, for this withered-looking stalk gave the impression of suddenly contracting into itself, and not only checked the swing of his muscle, but unmistakably commenced to draw it downward with a strong, steady pull. He stared in astonishment. A touch on his leg caused him to glance down. Several stems lay across his feet, and were coiling around his ankles, and, the motion was plainly visible, were moving in spiral fashion toward his knee. Then he knew fear, the fear which is an inexplicable horror of the unknown. He had no sort of conception or guess what this thing might be, but intuitively he knew that, unless he got clear at once, something awful would take place. He had no weapon. His thick staff he had dropped when stepping into the tangle. Underfoot, below the horrible stems, lay a rabble of sharp-edged stones, splinters from the heights above. In a frenzy, he thrust his hand recklessly between the stems and snatched up a triangular rock. The action was as instantaneous as the strike of a rattlesnake. Without a second's pause, he crashed the sharp stone down on the thing gripping his arm, heedless of injury to his person. The thing reared its bruised, blunted end as though in menace, yet it still held its grip tightly. He rained mad blows upon it, shredding his coat sleeve to ribbons and severely cutting his arm. Suddenly it fell to the ground cut in two. Kicking and struggling with the strength of frenzy, he tore his legs free from the strands which had wound around them. With one wild leap, he had cleared the mass and was speeding up the steep slope which confined the pool on its lower side. As he reached the top, no more than 50 feet above the water, he turned and stared backward. It seemed to him that the whole clump was nearer to him and further from the water than its original position had been, and its general outline appeared more compact and raised higher above the ground. Even as he stared, a single length, slightly ahead, deliberately raised its tip a foot in the air with a swaying sideways motion, as though something sightless was seeking some object. That was the finishing touch for Angus. With a hoarse yell of terror, he swung round and tore madly down the dangerous slope of Ben Creish. End of section 2. Section 3 of The Abysmal Horror by B. Wallis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 3. These two strange narratives, distortedly condensed, were engulfed by one of the great news services and through the medium of the press thrust upon the ever-avid public. Millions read the paragraphs and promptly forgot them. Batson was one of these millions, yet his imaginative subconscious self would not admit of a complete sloughing of such items, and they lay dormant until occasion was propitious for their resurrection. Such an occasion arose but a few days later. It happened in Windsor Park. Batson was a mildly inveterate cyclist. That is to say, he owned a cheap machine, and on Sundays took it religiously abroad. He found a certain modest enjoyment in the outing. Moreover, it gave him the sense and satisfaction of a duty fulfilled, his duty in contributing his quota toward the national prejudice in favor of physical exertion when divorced from the slightest chance of pecuniary remuneration. The day was a scorcher, and the shade of the park, after a 2 hours' run, a fitting reward. Therefore by noon he was sprawled on his back under an aged oak. A small, weed-grown pond lay a few feet in front of him. He was away from the crowd, which chattered and bustled at least a quarter of a mile distant, for he had taken an unusual step, both for Batson and for a law-abiding Briton. Having with secrecy and caution scaled the fence of a large covert, he slid his machine over and carefully hid it under a bush, and then pushed his way through the wood until he came upon this secluded pond, with its deep-grassed, shady banks and inviting peace. This entirely met his heart's desires. It was great to lie there alone and forget the grind of life. He awoke slowly, unwillingly. He must have slept some hours, for the light had greatly altered, and the shadows were long. Batson moved and yawned drowsily. He felt strangely heavy and disinclined to arise. He would have liked to lie there indefinitely, but the chains of habit were pulling. He had always made a point of negotiating the London traffic before lighting up time, and now he would have to put the pace up a notch to accomplish this. He rose to a sitting position. He certainly felt very queer, weak, and washed out. It puzzled him. He had felt as usual when he lay down, sleepy and pleasantly tired. That was all. Something irritating and clinging attracted his attention to his wrists. His right hand lay yet in the long grass, buried almost to the elbow. His gaze fell on his left hand, which rested now upon his knee. It was streaked with long meandering lines of red. He held it up and examined it closely. Some little brown thread-like stalks, thin and leafless, hung from his wrist. They seemed to be attached in some mysterious manner to his flesh, and each point of attachment was the source of one of those meandering red lines, whose other end, he now perceived, slowly dropped red blotches upon his trousers leg. Those streaks were blood, his own blood. Dumbfounded, he gazed at his upheld, dripping hand and the hanging scraps of withered-looking rubbish. What the deuce did it mean? What had happened? He drew his hand closer. Why, from the lower ends of the withered grass-like stems, little red drops were forming, exuding from this stuff. And even as he gazed, 2 complete globules detached themselves and fell heavily, with an audible splash, upon his clothes. "Good Lord!" exclaimed Batson. "They're drinking my blood!" But they were so thin and insignificant-looking that he felt nothing beyond amazement and indignation. "Some blasted foreign stuff these knobs have been raising," he muttered angrily, as yet too astonished to realize fully the extraordinary nature of such vegetation. Then he became aware that his wrists were hurting him. A dull aching, akin to a rheumatic pain, possessed them, and there was a prickly tingling at his ankles. He was wearing low cycling shoes, and his attention was drawn to them. The tall grass was here laid flat where he had moved in his slumber, and he could see that his feet and ankles were nearly hidden by a covering of these curious brown fibers, and for many feet around, in and out of the grass, he saw the ground was a mass of the stuff. He was certain that no such growth had been there when he first lay down. He stooped, forgetting for a moment the clinging things around his wrist, and became aware that the slender threads were connected to dark reddish-brown tuber-like things about the size and somewhat the shape of a small hen's egg, though irregular in outline and rough of surface. And they were moving, with a motion which suggested that their filaments were cables upon which they hauled. A sudden gust of revulsion and fear swept over him. He lifted one foot with its clinging tangle and brought it down viciously upon several of these tubers gathered closely together. The comparison of treading upon a monstrous and very soft slug flashed over him as from each side of his canvas shoe there shot a spurt of heavy red liquid which stained the dust-soiled cream of his shoe with ugly dark red blotches. There could be no doubt but it was blood, his blood. Then, as with the men whose narratives he now suddenly and oddly recollected with a dawning comprehension of the association, a quick, unreasoning fear fell upon Batson. "Here, I've had enough of this blasted stuff. It's alive!" he exclaimed disjointedly, and tore the clinging threads from his wrist, and experienced a disgust on finding that they felt in his grasp as though he had clutched a handful of soft, slimy worms. The stuff came away easily, and where it had been attached, the blood welled out in heavy drops. Shuffling one foot against the other, he rapidly scraped his feet free, and then, white and scared-looking, he made off at a pace that was practically a run. He uttered never a word until he reached his machine. Bundling it and himself over the fence, he stopped to take a breath and, Looking back with a long, frightening stare, he muttered, "Crikey, eating me up!" mounted his wheel, and made off at a rapid pace for the eastern entrance. Now these happenings, coming so closely together, and, moreover, in an off-season, attracted more attention from the press than otherwise might have been the case. For Batson had at once written a carefully composed and altogether unintelligible account to the editor of the Daily Telegram. This epistle had immediately been passed over to a cub reporter with instructions to fix it up. This youth returned with a story and a conviction that it was a good story. The Telegram ventured the thing and featured it. It took. The public, attuned to marvels by the advent of the giant meteor, ate it up with gusto. Windsor Park, in a twinkling, underwent an influx of humanity that staggered its custodians. But that particular spot where Batson had met his weird adventure was ringed by constables. The authorities, upon perusing the account, had, with prophetic acumen, requisitioned the available local force and wired the city for assistance. The officials, with a small force of attendants, made an immediate inspection of the spot, and, to their amazement, discovered that the account in the press was entirely correct. For they came upon the growth, now enormously multiplied and extended, so that it covered an area of nearly a quarter of an acre. Whether one or innumerable individuals, they did not endeavor to ascertain, but promptly, with scythe and billhook, they shortly had the queer, repulsive-looking stuff reaped and in piles, and, with the assistance of a liberal drenching with coal oil, fiercely burning. Then, with mattock and shovel, they turned the ground over and spread a coating of unslaked lime over all. As a good steward, the head ranger's action was commendable, but in the sight of science, it was an inexorable sacrilege. When Q finally received the official sanction to investigate, not a vestige could be found, but the unavoidable leakage from the assistants, and the emphatic affirmation of Batson constituted a base of proof which could not be ignored or overridden. Then commenced the reign of the scientific and pseudoscientific writer in the daily press. Explanations and theories were let loose upon the public by the score, to be quickly discounted by the characteristically restrained utterance of the great botanist biologist Sir James Tybehouse, the celebrated introducer of Balsae Tybehennis, a most economical substitute for silk, who advanced the supposition that this and other more remote cases reported of strange growths might possibly be connected with the recent visitor from the depths of space. As he remarked in an interview granted to Nature, it was conceivable that this fragment, cast forth by some unknown planet, might have come to us not at all altered from its original condition, carrying its freight of dormant seeds, only awaiting a favorable environment to quicken. When it encountered the uppermost strata of our atmosphere, though infinitely rarefied, immediately every movable object would be swept from its surface before the friction reduced it to a plastic incandescent mass. These particles, though following their parent for a while, would eventually drop behind and descend upon our globe. Life in such a planet might be hardly translatable into terms which we could comprehend, yet the basic factors for all growth, heat, and nutrition were here. Of course, in problems such as this, one could never attain to more than a logical deduction of the probabilities, yet it appeared to him, etc., etc. Coming from such a source, This opinion fired the imagination of the public and quickly became accepted as the only plausible explanation of these extraordinary growths. Hardly was the print of this interview dry when the Dorking tragedy sent a thrill of horror through the British Isles, and from being a scientific curiosity, the matter was in a single morning transformed into a deadly menace to countless lonely homesteads and hamlets. For on the outskirts of this old-world, slumbering country town, a woman and her little girl, straying on the great waste moorland there, had been done to death by these terrible invaders. Mere bloodless shells, they had been discovered lying amid a tangle of the growths at the bottom of a little secluded dell in a lonely part of the heath. The child still held in her baby hand a bunch of wild flowers not yet withered. The growth was identical with that encountered by the Ardgavon shepherd. A crowd of inflamed townsmen had immediately proceeded to the spot, and, falling upon the stuff, had with scythe and fire obliterated it. This time, however, a government expert was on the spot before the destruction was completed and secured a collector's case full of fragments of the stems and their appendages. While mere unrelated fragments, they yet formed a solid base for biological deduction, and it at once became known that a totally incomprehensible form of life had arisen in our midst, partaking of both vegetable and animal attributes. Science could only describe its structure and hold in suspense any estimate of the physiological functioning. Even yet, the point is a source of much envenomed controversy among the savants. That they were capable of some slight attachment to the soil, and might secure a portion of their nourishment therefrom, was possible, as a series of filaments at the base of some of the stems appeared to indicate. Yet the stems themselves were distinctly of animal structure, being, in fact, canals of assimilation with walls of immensely tough gristle. The appendages were more complex feeders of these stems, possessing a nucleus of striated fibers, very suggestive of sensory nerve material. Externally, they bore several orifices hidden by a folding membrane. Within each of these lay a hollow, tapering tube of horn-like composition, about 1.5 inches in length, and sharpened to the edge of a lancet. Inside this tube lay the lancet itself, a thin blade of the same horny substance. The function of these organs was obvious. A more efficient and deadly weapon for rending a victim and absorbing its blood and finely divided flesh could not be imagined. In short, the stems were grasping limbs of cable-like strength, and the thick fleshy appendages were the rending and masticating organs, probably also sensory centers of narrow limits. The fragments of the tuberous bodies they were known to possess were of too slight a nature to constitute a base of evidence of their anatomical structure, their cellular composition being quite unlike any living tissue hitherto known. These were the broad lines of the investigation, and as much as the general public could understandably absorb. The complex detail with which minute research invested the fragments, and eventually constituted a literature of its own, belonged solely to the devotees of science. But one thing was certain: humanity had a new and extremely dangerous enemy to face. To what extent, only the powers of these strange things to multiply and adapt themselves to their new environment could tell. That the various governments took a grave view of the visitation was at once apparent, for strenuous efforts to exterminate these growths were at once instituted by a definite concerted program of offense, national and local authorities combining with great energy in their efforts. Warnings and descriptions were placarded all over the country, and substantial rewards for their discovery were offered. Organized bands of searchers were detailed to scour the more remote and sparsely peopled districts, such as the great moors in the north and west, the lonely mountainous stretches of Wales and Cumberland, and in many another waste spot. And yet, as the days went by, the things increased and extended the area of their occupation in an ever-ascending ratio. Italy, Hungary, Spain in the south, Normandy, Holland, Belgium, and the British Islands in the north reported daily the spread of the things in spite of the vigorous efforts to suppress them, their growth, apparently, once they obtained a foothold, being as spontaneous and incalculable as a mushroom. Daily the occurrences took on a more serious aspect, and in place of their former complacent curiosity, a vague uneasiness came upon the people, and men like Batson asked one of the other, "These things now getting rather thick, aren't they? Might wipe out a lot of cattle, eh? What's the government doing? Time they woke up, that's what I think." Still, not 1 in 10 million had as yet come into personal contact with the invaders, even such insignificant things as Batson had encountered, of which, by the way, not half a dozen reported occurrences were known. The real awakening of England came 3 days after the Dorking tragedy, when, in the wild rugged stretch between Llanfair and Dinas Mawddwy in mid-Wales, a farmer, with his entire family, had been enmeshed by a huge colony of these terrible things, and most horribly perished. The farmer, one William Owen, his wife and 2 small children, had been on their way home from a friendly sing-song at a neighbor's that evening, and where their path dipped into a little bridged dell, in the dusk, without the least warning, they must have walked straight into the stuff. The man had put up a great fight, as evidenced by his torn apparel and the bruised condition of his remains, where the terrible stems had dug deep into his flesh in the struggle to retain their prey. Possibly by himself he might have made good his escape, but his family were hopelessly entangled, so, like a decent man, he died with them. A gasp of amazed horror throbbed through the masses when they learned the details. It appeared to them that an organized band of cold-blooded assassins had invaded their country, and neither man, woman, or child, from now on, would be safe from their ferocious cunning. Certain political parties made capital out of the intense emotion which pulsed the nation at this pitiless wiping out of a whole family. The party in power came in for a scathing attack, charging incompetency and even criminal indifference to the security of its citizens. The country was in an uproar, and a general election was imminent when the disaster of the Grimsby trawler, the White Wing, turned the unrest of the people into a raging passion for instant revenge and action, so that politics were forgotten, and both parties joined hands in planning some means of effective offense. The White Wing, in full sight of the fishing fleet, had been suddenly surrounded by what observers affirmed had the appearance, in the failing light, of being large masses of floating weed. At the hour, shortly before lighting up, the fleet had most of their dories out baiting, as is their custom, though the weather was rough and a gale impending. On board the vanished craft 1 man and a boy had been left in charge. Finishing their task, the dories were in the act of making for their respective craft, when the attention of the nearest men was attracted to the White Wing, which was perhaps about a half a mile distant. The wind was from her to them, and quite plainly could be heard loud shouting and cries for aid. Resting on their oars, in astonishment they perceived that the vessel had undergone a sudden and extraordinary change. No longer the trim, clean-lined vessel they all knew, now she bulked, in ungainly greater outline, with a covering of what looked like a vast, dark-colored matting, hung in festoons and ridges from gunwale to water. The men stared, transfixed with amazement, and then, seeing the White Wing's 2 dories were speeding at racing pace to their transfigured home, they too swung around and pulled lustily in the same direction, and at that moment the shouting abruptly changed to the screaming of men in great fear and peril. Probably at least a quarter of a mile separated this last boat from the 2 belonging to the White Wing. That space was their salvation. Their course lay at an obtuse angle to the other 2. By slightly turning their heads, they could clearly distinguish the field these 2 covered, and what they saw was the little craft go bobbing over the choppy sea until they had reached maybe within 50 feet of the strangely draped smack. And then something happened, so quickly that the watchers had hardly time to stop the way of their own dory before the thing was over, and the 2 little bobbing craft had vanished. Though the light now was fast failing, they had seen the 2 boats suddenly stop, though the men were still straining at oars, which hardly moved an inch as the water around them arose in a dark-hued, heaving mass, arose and in one swift gliding movement flowed over the gunwales, and a single terrible scream of fear came to the paralyzed watchers. Then there was nothing more heard or seen. The great dark blister subsided, and there was neither men nor boats, only the bare choppy sea, gray and desolate. And then the gale which had been brewing abruptly broke upon the speechless watchers in one tremendous squall, and only by the instinctive action of mariners in such circumstances they swung around in time to escape being swamped, and with great difficulty made their way back to their own home craft. But as they swung around, they had unconsciously noted that the White Wing, as she heeled over to the blast, seemed to have lost much of her incomprehensible drapery, and that is the last they or anyone else ever saw of her. Whether she sank in that squall or later in the severe gale, it was impossible to say. From that day it dawned upon the world that the long-established order of human domination was in jeopardy, and a new phase, a threatened return to the long-past elemental struggle for mere existence, was at hand. Neither land nor water now acknowledged the painfully acquired supremacy of man. New and enormously powerful factors had arisen which might well reduce civilization to a parlous state, if not entirely erase it from our planet. The masses turned in clamorous bewilderment to the governing bodies and demanded that men of science and action should replace the time-worn traditional politicians. With commendable self-abnegation, and demand was immediately met. In Britain, men of science took the initiative in the urgent conferences at Downing Street, and administrators listened humbly to their counsels. Extensive preparations, so far as men could prepare for the unknown future, were hastily got under way to combat what the savants predicted might descend upon humanity at any moment, an influx of these alien forms of life upon a scale inconceivably vast, for they realized by the wide area of their operations that the late tragedies were but the sporadic actions of the van of the host, rapidly engendering, and a mere hint of their incredible powers of multiplying and adapting themselves to their new environment. In such an uproar was the country that this reorganization was rushed through without an hour's delay, spurred to feverish haste by wireless reports from 100 varied sources at home and abroad, telling of fresh and more serious outbreaks on land and water. And so went by the last few days of July. End of section 3. Section 4 of The Abysmal Horror by B. Wallis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 4. The 1st of August saw the commencement of the hottest month ever known in northern Europe, an August which would have lived long in the memory of man, even if it had not proved very nearly the final month for the entire human species. The thermometer registered absurd heights, and the northern nations gasped and panted. Day after day the mercury crept up and up, 92 degrees, 94 degrees, and then with a jump to 99 degrees, which it may have held for 10 days or even 30, for from the 5th day of August the people ceased to take the least interest in the matter, and it is doubtful if even any records were kept. For by the end of the first 5 days of the month, the world had become panic-stricken with the horror of the fate confronting it, which was nothing less than the abrupt cessation of all traffic by water and the fast approaching extermination of every edible form of life upon our planet. Probably the abnormal temperature was the immediate cause of the almost spontaneous and undreamt of extension of the invaders. The first news of the outbreak was from the island of Corsica, and the wireless message came on the 4th day of the month, and was merely a bald statement that the island was encircled by an extraordinary belt of what appeared to be a giant species of seaweed. This was in the early dawn, and likely the operator's own conception of the phenomenon, for a little later came a more urgent message, a pressing plea for advice and aid from the civic body of Ajaccio, the capital, who were obviously alive to the fact that this was no mere unique drift of harmless weed. Yet so little did they grasp the real nature of the menace that they simply lamented over the possible effect of the invasion upon their main vocation, the sardine fishery, and urged that aid be afforded the island to disperse the vexatious growths. On the top of that plaintive appeal arrived a rush of excited reports of like conditions from the great ports in every part of the Mediterranean. But these were messages of senders who understood the gravity of the menace, and they had, with hastily requisitioned and powerfully engined vessels, essayed to destroy the stuff by charging full speed through and through the incoming swelling belt. As at Corsica, the drift had made its appearance in the early dawn as a line of apparently drifting seaweed about 2 miles distant from the coast, and from that time rapidly increased in breadth toward the land, vast hordes rising in a continual stream to the surface at the well-defined limit of their first appearance. The offensive adopted was entirely futile, the short channels the craft plowed being immediately closed again by submerged thousands welling up from the depths, and shortly the vessels employed were solely occupied in endeavoring to extricate themselves from the trap in which they found they had become entangled. After the impetus of the charge became exhausted, it was discovered that even the great engines could make no headway against the densely packed mass ahead. Arrested, their screws thrashed and churned the tough growth to pulp, yet ever more and more slowly, until finally they stopped, choked by the dead weight and gristly strength of thousands of entwined limbs. A few escaped, the majority remained hopelessly embedded, their crews staring in silent consternation at the writhing, ceaseless movement of the enormous drift. This happened late in the day. Thereafter, certain messages came through which the authorities for a little while suppressed, though from that moment 1,000 wireless warnings flickered to 1,000 incoming craft, urging them to make all speed possible to port, but at all cost to hold a good offing when in sight of land until notified further. Fast torpedo craft and racing launches shot out from 100 widely spread ports around the British coast to speak to vessels lacking wireless fittings, and other grim vessels of war steamed out to sea with more militant instructions. The dawning of the 5th day of August justified the mad haste of the preceding hours. Before the sun blazed its full circumference above the horizon, it was known to the nation that their country was in the act of being isolated and shut off from the trafficking in foodstuffs so necessary to their existence. There could be no reason to doubt that the progress of the invasion would duplicate that of the other countries affected. The great crowds holiday-making at the coast resorts in the vicinity of the larger ports were aroused by the continuous crashing detonations of high explosives. Rushing to the seafront, they had strained their eyes in a thick white mist which each day lay upon the ocean until the rising sun dispersed it, to be replaced very shortly by haze of heat almost as dense. At this early hour the field of vision was too restricted to permit of sighting the initial thin line of invaders. With Anglo-Saxon common sense, they returned to their breakfast, household stocks held out for several days, and hurriedly gulping whatever the early hour afforded, trooped back to the front. By now the mist had somewhat cleared, and the crashing reports, freed of their smothering blanket, came more loudly to the ears of the watchers in their hundreds of thousands at Margate and Ramsgate, and rattled the windows ceaselessly. The 5th, as many will recollect, fell that year upon a Sunday, and Ramsgate, with a normal population of under 20,000, housed that day well over 200,000. Always a popular resort of weekend trippers, the abnormal heat had not lessened its popularity. Among this great squeeze was Batson, who, with 50,000 others, had availed themselves of the cheap Saturday to Monday excursion, all immensely excited by the messages of the vast invading hordes in the south, and the likelihood that any day might witness a similar eruption in England's home waters. Batson, with a natural aptitude for worming his way through crowds, before long found himself at the pier-head. Later, the press in the rear made the performance impossible for anything larger than a weasel. Already, it was barely 8 o'clock. The glare and power of the sun's reflected rays upon the water was almost unbearable. The day promised to become the hottest yet, and land and sea fairly throbbed with the swelter. Though the mist had vanished, a fast-gathering blur of heat was settling as a veil, which shortly would bring the horizon even closer than it had been. But for the moment, the incoming horde was clearly discernible. Moreover, the serpent-like band was much broader, and by just so much the nearer. So rapid had been its increase that now it had attained to nearly half a mile in width, and the rumor went round that, from the Bristol Channel to the North Sea, it extended in one unbroken vast line. Inert and innocuous as it appeared in the distance, the great crowd staring at that enclosing belt from many a town and village along the southern coast felt a throb of pulse and a catch at heart as they realized the countless millions of these strange growths which must lie even within their restricted field of vision. Though the last staggering news from southern Europe had not yet been made public, they instinctively sensed that the awful and unique tragedies, isolated though they were, hinted at unknown horrors and terrible possibilities connected with the approach of such an enormous and seemingly intelligent invasion. An hour passed, and the huge drifting line was obviously increased, and the increase was more rapid than at the commencement of the vigil. The haze was now thickening upon the water. Vessels large and small loomed up in the distance as blurred outlines and uncertain masses, hovered for a little while, then with sudden speed faded into nothingness. The roaring reverberations of the exploding bombs crashed by incessantly, for now the news had gone round of the vigorous offensive measures in progress, in the attempt to destroy or divert the things in the vicinity of the great shipping centers. Hundreds of planes were raining bombs on the drifting growth, and huge-engined war craft were also being employed in cruising up and down the outer fringe, flailing the myriads with thrashing screws. Millions of the things were sliced to ribbons, and in the slimy, swirling wake of each hard-driven vessel appeared ever a denser press of the endless stream of indomitable life. Warned by those suppressed messages, the vessels held to the fringe, and so avoided the fate which had overtaken those enmeshed foreign craft. Yet one was not to escape, and the terrible tragedy occurred in full view of Batson and the crowded seafront at Ramsgate. Out of the shrouding haze came at a 40-knot clip the lately launched destroyer Ariadne. 1,500 tons and 15,000 horsepower, she embodied the last word in marine inventive genius. She slipped through the water almost hidden by the wave cast up from the knife-like edge of her racing stem. Pulsing with vibrant, resplendent life, she shot into view, and without a second's pause swung around in a sharp curve, dashed into the stupendous horde, striking it at a slanting blow, and penetrated several 100 feet. To the astounding watchers it appeared as though she had suddenly rung off her engines, as she scraped over a submerged sandbank or mudbank, for her bow was observed to rise high above the waterline with a sharp mounting motion, hang suspended for a second, and then plunge downward as if she had surmounted the obstacle. A few declared that she moved a little way succeeding this convulsion, but to the majority that strange upward fling was her final effort. How it happened that this unaccountable move was taken never came to light. Whether it was merely the impulsive action of a rash, hot-headed man, an error in the transmission of commands, or a defect in her steering gear, can never be proven. No man ever learned the reason of that disobedience of implicit orders issued but a few hours earlier. Of her complement of 154 officers and men, not one returned. From where Batson stood, the Ariadne was some 2 miles distant, and the haze blurred all detail. Many had glasses, but they merely enlarged the smudge without exposing further particulars. But Batson could distinctly discern the simple fact that, in the vicinity of the motionless craft, the dark belt appeared to darken as though the crowding millions were rising above the surface, which must have actually been the case, for shortly it seemed as if the vessel was resting upon a low-lying islet, which grew in stature even as he strained his eyes in amazement at this inexplicable phenomenon. A flash of vivid flame shot from the ship's side, and then another, and still another. The boom of the first explosion came crashing by. "Good Lord, they're firing!" said Batson to his neighbor. "Yes, what they getting at? Guns ain't no good agin that stuff," replied his Cockney neighbor. "I reckon not. Queer, they're at it again," exclaimed Batson, as the vivid flashes broke from her side again. "I wonder. Surely it isn't possible," he muttered excitedly. "What ain't possible? What you talking about?" queried his neighbor impatiently. "Well, that stuff out there. Suppose it was big and strong enough to be dangerous to a ship," replied Batson thoughtfully. "What? That bloomin' weed? Rush the British Navy? No bloody fear. Might hurt a baby, but couldn't do nothing agin the Navy. You take my word on that." And as he spoke, the wireless on the Ariadne was crackling its message to the naval craft miles away in the Thames estuary. "We're caught. Send a plane with bombs, quick. This stuff is rising alongside, in mounds, millions of them, arms 20 feet long." Within 15 minutes, a buzzing airplane was hovering over the spot, but the Ariadne had vanished 5 minutes after the message had gone forth. Batson and the crowds on the front had seen the islet as a dark blotch rise from the water, rise until the blurred outline of the Ariadne became shapeless and unrecognizable, and the firing ceased as the hill, born of the ocean, towered higher and higher, quickly reaching to several times the height of the hidden vessel. Aghast and speechless, the crowd saw the great mound abruptly subside from the peak into itself, flatten, hollow out, saucer shape, and then, once more, there was only the smudgy drab of the unbroken level of the awful growths. "My God!" muttered Batson. The man by his side still stared in silence, the expression of a puzzled child on his rough features. Then, close by, a woman screamed, a short, hysterical note. The Cockney shivered and found his voice. "My guard! Like me stepping on a beetle. What is this stuff?" He turned on Batson and demanded fiercely. "I dunno, rightly, that is. No one knows," he replied weakly. "They say it came on the baby." The people had so christened their giant visitor. "Seeds they were, blown off away high up. No one knows rightly what they are. Maybe they're animals, maybe plants. Anyway, they're terrible things. Kill everything that comes their way. Got some sort of a brain, too. I tell you, we're all in the soup. Likely wipe out the lot of us." This supposition was purely a personal opinion, and by no means as yet commonly held. For a little while, hardly realizing the terrible and staggering nature of the horrible tragedy they had just witnessed, the throngs on the pier excitedly discussed the inexplicable disaster, being strangely consoled by the unanimous assumption that some unspecified personage would be severely dealt with. Then, abruptly, those in front became aware that the incoming horde had advanced considerably while they had been settling this matter. It might not be so very long before the van would be brushing the massive granite blocks below them. A sudden hush fell upon the crowd as they grasped this fact. A lurch, more of a throb than an actual movement of muscle, sped through the tightly packed mass. "Here!" exclaimed the Cockney, addressing those in his immediate rear. "You blokes go back. I'm off home, I am. These will be here soon, and I ain't going to be, not after seeing what they done out there. Get back, you bloody fools!" he shouted, as none stirred, it being impossible to do so. But in an instant the man's words were upon 100 lips. "Get back! Get back! They're coming!" Men shouted, women screamed the words. Panic took possession of the crowd. Arms with tightly clenched fists rose above the swaying crush, rose to descend with maniac force upon the faces of those in the line of retreat. Cursing, blaspheming, men fought to kill, and women tore with fingers rigid as claws. Beside the insanity of panic, there lay the added horror of being hurled over the unprotected edge of the pier, and who could tell what fearful things already lurked unseen in the depths? In their desperate struggles to retreat from the edge, the crowd swayed from side to side, and at every swing some poor wretch was swept over the side to fall screaming and frantically clawing at the smooth stonework as he went. Gradually, from the landward end of the pier, the people, now aware of the fearful struggle going on ahead, opened out, and while the van of the horde was still many hundred feet from the pier, it was vacated. How many perished in that panic will never be known. At the time, except to the individual, it was quite immaterial, merely a trivial incident in the great ocean of disaster which had flooded the world. Batson, for fate had extricated him, returned to town, stretched flat on the roof of an ancient third-class carriage, for though the railroad officials were powerless to enforce the regulations, yet the low-pitched English tunnels compelled, at any rate, a humble posture. Luck again was with him. After that, Sunday night traveling was for the time strictly prohibited, the authorities fearing a wholesale migration to the great inland centers and a consequent emptying of the rural and producing districts. That hundreds of thousands were separated from their families and placed in a deplorable plight had not the slightest weight with the cold, acute brains now in absolute power. To these men, the individual was non-existent. The rationing system, crude as it was, provided the bare necessities of life to all alike, wherever they might be. Batson, like most Britons, had the home instinct strongly developed, and returned to his rather frowsy room with a sigh of relief. Here, anyway, were the old familiar things pregnant with the spirit of the old order. He had not a duty or a task to execute, for all private business had abruptly ceased. He had already registered at the local office. Save extreme youth and age, the whole nation had been conscripted. The experience of past critical periods, sadly bungled at the time, now facilitated the prompt prosecution of this work. There would be no bungling this time or sentimental pitfalls. Implicit obedience or instant drastic punishment was the fiat for all. The streets were thronged with restless, eager crowds, restless from ignorance, eager for news. From bulletin board to bulletin board they wandered incessantly. The press had orders to display immediately all news censored by the authorities, and huge blackboards had been hastily erected high up on the fronts of their establishments. As Batson wormed his way from Fleet Street to the Strand, where a nest of great dailies have their offices, a sudden hush fell upon the crowd. He was too distant to decipher the large chalk words which the men on the staging were inscribing, but, close by, an adipose, well-dressed individual, possessed of a pair of field or opera glasses, delivered the message to his neighbors as each word appeared. In a clear, educated tone, he read out: New York. Appearance of the weed in West Indies. Central America and Panama Canal reported beset. Huge hordes pouring in. Way completely blocked. Aeroplanes using explosives, endeavoring to destroy canal and stop communication with Pacific. So far unsuccessful. Drift extends from Greenland to Florida, rapidly increasing. Marseille, France. All craft caught in drift Saturday have been sunk by weight of growths swarming on them. France, Italy, Spain, in hands of anarchists. Terrible battles and casualties have occurred. Such was the writing on the board, the merest outline of the vast tragedies being enacted. It was noteworthy that the crowd listened silently and later wandered off in little groups, conversing thoughtfully. The blow which had fallen upon the world had rocked the base upon which humanity had for thousands of years built its progress. The dominance of the human species had never once, since the earliest of prehistoric days, been questioned, nor in that gap had a doubt ever troubled humanity that it might not emerge victorious from every conflict with antagonistic life. And now the millions were anchorless and mentally paralyzed by the shock of the discovery that, after all, civilization might only be an insignificant and ephemeral phase of the evolution of our planet. The heavens were rocking, and gods falling. The great majority were incapable of readjusting their basic convictions, and would pass away unconvinced that the human species merely endures so long as conditions are favorable. End of section 4. Section 5 of The Abysmal Horror by B. Wallis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 5. The invasion of the canal was a most convincing and extraordinary proof that these things were endowed with an intelligence other than mere sensory reaction to external stimuli. This invasion was obviously a deliberate movement to attain a further field of action for their expansion. Some inexplicable instinct had informed them that, beyond this narrow way, there lay a great tract of ocean teeming with edible matter. For at the entrance the adjacent water quickly became congested with the growths forming an enormous crescent-shaped mass, many times the width of the far-flung parent belt, and the movement here was more rapidly inward, so much so that in a few hours the first of the invaders had entered the channel. It had been presumed that the massive gates of the several locks would constitute an effective barrier. Though warned by the frightful disasters in Europe, the futility of such a defense might have been gauged, but no cable could convey to the mind the true realization of the stupendous hordes and their invincible progress. There was no precedent to enable the human brain to grasp the fact that here was life as illimitable and uncontrollable as the oceans. The watchers by the first gate, a little crowd of engineers, assistants, and dark-skinned laborers, gazed in silent awe as the waters below them surged upwards and backwards as a solid mass of writhing monsters appeared almost like a piston rod driving the water ahead of them. No simile commonly used could picture the scene these men gazed upon. The matted mass of worms in an angler's bait can might faintly indicate their solidity of formation, but nothing, save the cinema, could impart the terrible forward urge and vast vitality which infused these things. The living torrent came to the great gates. Without a second's pause, a slimy mass of dark green life arose from the surface. Up and up the face of the gates it ascended, the base of the mound growing greater as the crest arose. Higher and higher, with a movement almost as the flow of a heavy liquid, the mound reared itself, and in a moment was pouring over the top of the gates to the water beyond. Without a break or a gap, As molten metal leaves a crucible, the flow of horrible life went up and on, and then the watchers were compelled hastily to retreat, for the planes which had been summoned from the nearby naval base commenced to rain their bombs into the hordes below. For fear of injuring the canal, they had until now reserved their fire. An hour later, all their efforts were centered in destroying the channel, and so erecting some barrier which these things could not surmount. But the means at hand to effect this program of destruction were insufficient to accomplish more than the erasing of a gate and pitting the sides of the canal with numerous craters. To have piled an effective barrier across that gap, many hundred tons of high explosives would have been necessary, and many weeks of strenuous work in the placing of them. Doubtless, the great bombs may have resolved millions of the monstrous growths to mere atomic dust, but this deletion had no more visible effect than the extermination of a few thousand mosquitoes in a mud swamp by an enraged sufferer. Had it been possible to flood the canal with gigantic jets of steam and boiling water, it might have stayed these things. As it was, by noon, the attackers had relinquished their efforts and, flitting from point to point, simply reported the progress of the stream. There was no more to be done. Lacking time to prepare, civilization had shot its bolt and been defeated. To say that the water was completely filled with the writhing, shapeless things would be incorrect, for not a drop of water was visible. The water merely permeated the mass as ether permeates all material. The awe-stricken watchers on the banks above remained throughout the night, rooted to the spot by the marvel of their incredible numbers, as in silence the nightmare mass passed along. Their squirming, cable-like tentacles, in constant movement, were every now and again raised in hummocks and ridges, as though the pressure from below was too great for the topmost layers to restrain. In those abrupt heavings, numerous darker, ungainly masses were shot to the surface for a brief second, to be absorbed again as the waves subsided. To these repulsive masses, the tentacles were attached as limbs to a body, and yet the animal impression so afforded was instantly repressed by the curious frond-like appearance of the thick appendages which clustered around every tentacle. No single member of all the raffle could be traced either to its source or its extremity, so inextricably interwoven were the horrors of that terrible throng. And ever the horde steadily writhed its forward way until, by nightfall, the van of the invaders had made the passage and the mighty Pacific lay before them. Thus commenced the isolation by sea of the North American continent. Meanwhile, on the Atlantic seaboard, the drift had appeared as far north as Cape Hatteras, in detached hordes which were fast bridging the gaps and forming a connected belt. All vessels in the vicinity of the coast had been hastily rushed either to harbors or beached and immediately abandoned, for it was known to every country now that those enmeshed foreign craft had, to a ship, vanished, as a little later had the Ariadne. Beyond the temporary dislocation of internal traffic and transportation, due largely to the natural excitement of the people, the great American continent was not otherwise seriously discommoded. Later, the stoppage of certain supplies of foreign origin would necessarily disrupt many important industries, but regarding the problem of simple existence, the nation had little to fear. Of wheat and livestock, they had always a surplus for export. Coal, iron, and timber they possessed in abundance. Granting these 5 commodities, a modern people can maintain a civilization but little altered from their present status. In Europe, one or two of the more favored countries might, at a pinch, manage to survive, but the majority, now mere assembling plants of others' raw material, must undoubtedly cease to exist either as nations or even as habitations of the human species. A certain small percentage of the peoples might possibly survive, though how it should be determined who these were to be, it was impossible to conceive. However the decision was reached, it promised a veritable welter of blood and savagery as a prelude. Humanity had suddenly run against a bare, unscalable wall in the path of its rapid progress, and it appeared as though, in future, the movement might well be a retrograde one. These happenings in the New World filtered gradually through to the masses in the storm-tossed European centers, and excited but little interest. They had troubles to spare of their own. Moreover, the fact that so far not a single growth on the land had troubled that nation aroused in the Batsons of a dozen countries an indefinable irritation. It struck them that this omission showed undue favoritism from some unknown source. It certainly was strange that from the 35th south parallel north to the Arctic Ocean, not a single occurrence of these things had been noted. Probably some atmospheric condition had diverted the fall of the seeds from the continent, or even the path of the giant visitor may have taken a course unfavorable to their descent upon this portion of our planet. However it happened, only in the extreme south of the Argentine were the terrestrial growth at that date discovered. The most strenuous endeavors of every nation concerned would be immediately turned to confining them to this small area, though the success of this undertaking was extremely doubtful. Batson read of this in a copy of the Telegram, which had cost him the sum of 1 shilling. The paper consisted of a single sheet containing cables from abroad, telephone and wireless messages from the continent and home points, and sundry government proclamations. He learned, with some regret, that he had not remained to witness the astounding spectacle that Ramsgate, in common with 100 other coast towns, was now walled in to the seaward by a horde of the growths of such enormous numbers that, at low tide, they actually formed an embankment some 10 or 12 feet in height, built entirely of those left by the receding tide, and extending in like depth to the floating drift. Each tide, the message affirmed, was adding to this awful wall. The pier, upon which he had stood watching, and the long jetty, were mere shapeless ridges hidden by countless thousands of these things. Beyond the limit of high tide, the beach was untouched by the invasion, and it was quite apparent these unique forms of life were not amphibious, for lying there exposed to the fierce blaze of the sun, the stranded things withered and died in a few hours, as any other marine life would under similar circumstances. As they shriveled, a most penetrating stench arose from them, an odor quite distinct from that associated with putrefying tissue. This odor was at first not so offensive, but the longer it endured, the more unbearable it became. So sickening and irritating did it grow. They died by billions, the outermost layers of that endless encircling wall, but it was noticed that the under layers, protected from the sun, recovered their vitality on the return of the tide, and ever the dead dried layers on the surface heaved and sank in proof of the surging life beneath. Curious and excited throngs drew as close as they dared to the wall of life, until in a little while the offensive stench drove the most reckless inland. Intermingled though these things were, yet, bit by bit, one could piece out their structure and form a fair idea of their appearance as individuals, and the majority were agreed that each consisted of a large central mass somewhat the shape and bulk of an enormous gourd. In color, a dark oily green, its surface was rough and corrugated as the hide of a crocodile, no orifice of any kind being apparent. From this mass arose the long tentacles, possibly half a dozen, though they seemed to vary in individuals, as thick at the base as a man's calf, and tapering through their 20 feet or so of length to the thickness of a man's arm at the base to half an inch at the extremity. These limbs were much more sinewy than the central mass, and about midway down their gristly lengths there sprouted peculiar frond-like appendages. Thick, fleshy, and shapeless, they bore a close resemblance to the grotesque protuberances of a giant cactus. These were practically identical in structure and function, though more massive, with the similar excrescences possessed by the terrestrial species. Batson read of these matters with great disquiet of soul. He muttered as a prophetic vision came upon him. "We've got a knockout this time. It ain't war, it ain't nothing we know of. It's the end of everything. These things'll sweep the whole world clean. They'll starve us out, choke the seas, and the stuff on land will finish the business." This latter assertion was the result of the enormous increase of the things in the last few days, despite the fact that every little village had its organized band of destroyers patrolling the vicinity day and night. But it was impossible to check the spread of the stuff. Their generation, coincident with the abnormal heat, had increased so rapidly, and their growth from seed to maturity appeared now to be a matter of a mere 24 hours, if not less. No part of the country was secure from their horrible presence. Moors, woods, fields, even private grounds on the outskirts of towns, gave birth to their vicious life. But always were they discovered in the vicinity of water or marshy land, and it seemed a certainty that this element was a necessary factor in their rapid early maturing, for this preference was noted in every land beset by them. With consternation it was also noted their intelligence, sensitiveness to environment, call it what one would, apparently had increased greatly, for wherever it was possible by nature of the ground to elude observation, there were they found, in copses, hedgerows, tangled clumps of brambles and briars, so common in rural England. They lay in wait for whatever came their way. This applied solely to the immature growths. Later, in colonies, they moved slowly across wide stretches of country. This traveling was undertaken entirely during the hours of darkness, and doubtless rendered the capture of their prey a simple matter. For once, even a small colony had surrounded the most vigorous animal and whipped their gristly tentacles upon it. There would be no escape. The deadly lances would be applied, and the victim's lifeblood drained as it vainly struggled. Their duration of life was unknown and immaterial. It was their stupendous power of reproduction that constituted the awful menace. From all over the country, reports came pouring in of the loss of cattle, horses, and livestock of every description, and also other more terrible losses, where human beings had fallen a prey to their rapacity. In the neighborhood of the great moors and forests, where they had, unobserved, formed large communities covering many acres in extent, it was almost impossible to secure labor to work the farms. Such was the dread inspired by these lurking, silent things. For every individual or colony destroyed, 3 were discovered the following day. Daily, the situation increased in gravity, as though the abnormal heat wave, which never abated a single degree for nearly 3 weeks, approximated to their natural environment, and daily the food supply of Britain rapidly vanished. At the end of the first week succeeding the appearance of the encircling drift, flour was being eked with every variety of grain, and even husks and straw treated by a process of maceration. The meat ration had been cut to £1 a week, and that included even horse flesh. But the livestock of the nation would soon be exhausted. Rather oddly, certain luxuries, such as tea, coffee, tobacco, there was no stint of. Anticipating a rising market, the shipments of these things had been unusually heavy only a few weeks previously. Stocks on hand would certainly last out the basic necessity, therefore there was no occasion to ration them. These conditions were more or less prevalent in most European countries, though in the South the more excitable Latins had the added horror of civil strife and mob rule to aggravate the disaster, and the natural consequence of this disorganized condition was that actual starvation had, in many parts, come to the distracted populace. Frantic efforts were being made to tap the vast resources of Russia, Siberia, and the great Slavonic grain-producing plateaus, but the time was too short. Had the world been warned 12 months ahead, there might have been a fair chance of averting the annihilation which was so imminent. Huge fleets of aircraft were being hastily assembled in every European center, though it was obvious that these could never transport 1,000th part of the supplies necessary to feed the clamoring millions. Even presuming the supplies were available, which was more than doubtful, since both Australia and South America reported the appearance of growths upon the land identical with the European species, and it could only be a matter of a few weeks before these countries were themselves confronted with a similar fate. For the secret of their sudden appearance in localities previously immune, and the rapidity of their spread, was discovered to be due to the peculiar nature of their seeding and the minute size of the seeds. Like a few of our own large flora, the seeds bore no proportionate relation to their progenitors, being mere specks which the least breath of air would be sufficient to transport. The fertilization and forming of them was conducted in small sacs placed just within the tough membrane covering the large central mass. When fully developed, these sacs burst asunder with such violence that the contents were shot forth for several yards, even as on a much reduced scale 1 or 2 of our common fungi perform a similar operation. Alighting on exposed surfaces, each atmospheric movement carried them still further from their source, while a moderate breeze might easily transport them over considerable distances. One could not strive against wind-blown dust. It was a hopeless struggle humanity was engaged upon, and the end was inevitable, the extinction of every living thing, save these terrible aliens. Later, possibly, these too would cease to exist, and the ghastly story of our evolution would have to start afresh. End of section 5. Section 6 of The Abysmal Horror by B. Wallis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 6. Batson secured work in a machine shop, working day and night upon airplane fittings, one of the thousands throughout the country. He had not been compelled to undertake this work. Though the whole nation was at the disposal of its chosen rulers, there was no need of compulsion. The crisis was too dire and imminent to breed laggards. Wages were non-existent, and cash payments, except for certain minor luxuries apart from foodstuffs, fuel, and transportation, were abolished. Thus all, rich and poor, were practically on the same level, a policy which went far to bind the nation into one cohesive unit. But daily the rations were narrowing, and the weird, deadly growths increasing. Though in the struggle to exterminate them, untold numbers were destroyed by the numerous bands of men and women detailed for that purpose, yet it was like trying to mop up the incoming tide with a sponge. By the 20th of the month, the people of the British Isles had realized that now only a miracle could save the nation from extinction. On land, there was not a county, a district, or hardly a square mile where the terrible things could not be found, in every wood and hedgerow, in vast numbers. Worn with the hopeless work and impoverished in brain and body, the people nevertheless fought grimly on, determined to die fighting, as is the habit of English-speaking humanity. But hope was dead. The great drift, encircling the islands, flowed ever inward, each tide spewing up its millions to swell the awful ridge. Only at the mouths of the rivers was this ridge missing. Here the growths invariably parted to left and right. Directly the influence of the fresh water might be presumed to extend. For some reason they abhorred fresh water, and would not advance a foot within it, for all of their desperate striving to attain the land. The theory was advanced that, in the planet of their origin, the land was in the process of emerging from the waters, as once, some millions of years gone by, our own continent slowly arose. Probably in this primeval world, sailing channels and sloughs extended over the greater portion of this low-lying land, forming vast, water-sogged wastes. Here it was likely this rapacious life found a congenial spawning ground, or, again, it might be that this was their larder, for here in the warm water and mud would be a teeming life, almost inexhaustible. Whatever the origin, it could only be some hereditary instinct which drove them landward so inexorably. On the never-to-be-forgotten 25th day of August, Batson wearily trudged to his work. For breakfast he had munched his 4 ounces of bread, 9/10 of which was husks and chemically treated straw, and 1/10 flour, composed of a dozen different grains. Butter had vanished from the dietary almost from the first day of rationing. Jams and canned preserves had held out until a few days ago. Tea and coffee were still in evidence, though every grain was now boiled until it no longer tinted the water. 1 ounce of lard per day, and a weekly allowance of a pound of gristle or bone, as luck would have it, lent a faint aroma to the mockery of a meal, but even this, they had been warned, would in a day or two be missing, and the bread dole would cease in less than a week's time. Experiments had been made with every possible material which might be a source of food supply. Even the cause of all this suffering, the awful growths on sea and land, had been essayed as a means of sustaining life, but they were found to be most deleterious in the smallest quantities, and in larger, actively poisonous, those partaking being attacked with severe internal pains, ending in partial paralysis and coma. The nation was entering its last few days of existence, and the people, in hopeless despair, awaited the end. Already in other countries less efficiently organized and lacking the Anglo-Saxon stolidity of temperament, hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, had perished. There was no telling accurately, so disrupted were the usual means of tabulating vital statistics. In the New World, conditions, though sufficiently grave, had as yet brought no serious suffering or peril to the people. Possessing vast internal sources of the raw necessaries of life, the people of the United States and Canada were in no immediate danger. In the United States, the nation had arisen as one man and demanded that their entire resources and efforts should be devoted to the alleviation and succor, as far as humanly possible, of their stricken fellow men. The air fleet, already the largest in the world, and possessing craft capable of transporting 100 passengers across the Atlantic, were even now racing on their homeward trip from the British Isles, loaded to the limit with fleeing humanity fortunate enough to obtain passage. For while all the fleets of the world could not have fed a moiety of those starving millions, yet a certain number might be snatched from the very jaws of death. Already several thousand had been so transported. Seats in these craft were obtained by ballot, a district being allotted to each vessel as it appeared, the seats having been previously drawn for. Thus there was not a moment's delay, and 4 days after leaving their home coast, they had returned, and were disgorging their human freight, among which the millionaire and the meanest beggar were shipmates. Thousands of aircraft were being feverishly assembled in every state of the Union by men who worked until they dropped at their machines, and waiting men snatched the tools from their hands without a belt being slipped. The horror of the merciless slaying of a nation, people akin to them in blood and speech, had gripped the humblest worker in the land and controlled his every thought and action. That these aircraft could never be used before the awful tragedy was consummated was realized, yet men had to work. The human brain would not stand the terror of thought in idleness. Batson, on that 25th day of August, had worked steadily through the morning, dully, hopelessly, but doggedly. He knew that death was but a few days from him, yet his own dissolution had the edge of its awe blunted by the enormity of the catastrophe. Probably few in these latter days were supremely concerned over their own little portion in the fast approaching finale. The magnitude of the thing overwhelmed the ego, but the common people, such as Batson, though he would have indignantly repudiated the offensive classification, were sick of the waiting and suspense. Therefore, though the work on the craft went ahead with all dispatch, the spirit of the workers had no share in it. The 12 o'clock whistle was on the point of sounding, when through the hum of the big lays broke a swelling roar of human voices. So silent had been the huge city of late that the unwonted commotion aroused in him an interest out of all proportion to the event. Deliberately, he drew back the lever which broke the couplings of his machine to the main shaft. His neighbors, encouraged by his lead, followed suit. The foreman came striding up with a fierce query in his hard eyes. Batson held up his hand and beckoned for silence, which was a piece of impudence for even a voluntary worker. But the light of battle faded from the foreman's eye, and he remained in a posture of intense alertness. The drone of the lays no longer intervening, the full volume of the distant cheering came through the open windows with startling import. For it was cheering, salvo after salvo of unrestrained emotion, sustained, swelling. No listener could miss the note of enthusiasm and tense joy which pulsed in the sound. As they stood, mute and wondering, the sound drew nearer, as though thousands closer had caught the infection. "What the dickens?" queried Batson of no one in particular. "By Jove, what?" remarked his neighbor. "Who the hell?" ejaculated his mate. Then, without another word, in a second the open door was jammed with struggling men, In a staggering knot they reached the street. From every door similar little crowds were being shot forth. At the end of the street, several blocks away, a man appeared in the center of the road. He was running madly, hatless, coatless, arms waving, and as he ran he was shouting vociferously in a shrill falsetto which carried to them clearly, "Praise the Lord of Judah! We're saved! Are going to hell!" And some other things he bawled, but they were so interlarded with inconsequent profanity that they conveyed no meaning. Likely enough, he was a decent family man, but now he was, for the time, merely a foul-mouthed lunatic. As the watchers stared, the cheering came racing to them, spreading fan-wise in every direction. Street after street, block after block, the frenzy of sound was growing rapidly into the roar of millions of delirious humanity. None could resist the call of that mad joy, and in a moment the cobbled street was clanging with the racing feet of hundreds, drawn by the infection of that high emotion. And suddenly they found themselves surrounded by a throng of dancing, singing, yelling maniacs. Or apparently they were, for men were revolving rapidly in the embrace of other men, progressing in an impromptu waltz, obviously indifferent and unaware of any known objective. Others were throwing aloft their headgear and coats, and yelling with mirth as they witnessed them fall to be instantly stamped underfoot by their companions. Many were insanely fighting with both foot and fist, though, lacking the will which usually accompanies such efforts, no great damage seemed to result. And amidst the bedlam of noise and motion, there arose high-pitched callings on the name of their author, bawlings of intense emotion, even supreme adoration. Women with disheveled tresses and staring eyes, some singing, some praying in hysterical fervors, many with tears streaming down their flushed cheeks, ran by the side of the men. The majority of these women could be classed at a glance. Their trade had stamped them ineffaceably, harpies and harlots of the lowest type, women whose emotions had never known the leash of spiritual control. Nevertheless, not one but was swayed at the moment by an intense joy which was not entirely selfish or ignoble. "Here!" exclaimed Batson, catching hold of a small man who, laughing foolishly, was engaged most successfully in grinding underfoot a hard felt hat. "What the deuce is the racket about? Are you all gone loony, or what?" "Hooray! Hooray!" bawled his prisoner, squirming in his grasp. "Stop it!" yelled Batson heatedly, "or I'll biff you one on the snout." And his tone must have carried conviction, for the man eyed him with distinct apprehension and replied sensibly enough, "Who are you talking to? Just try it on. Ain't you heard the news? We're saved. They're going to wipe these bloody things out. The Yank has fixed up some chemical poison. It's sure death to them. All in the newspapers. Let go my arm, you blasted fool!" And he wrenched himself free, shouting as he ran, "Hooray! Hooray!" "It's the bloody truth," said a young, brazenly good-looking girl who had been coolly watching the incident, evidently in expectation of witnessing a vigorous rough and tumble. "The little bloke's right. Sort of a plague-like. They'll fade out same as snow in hell. They got it in print on the boards. I seen it myself. Praise Gord, we're saved!" she suddenly and most fervently shrieked. For some little while that was the last distinct impression he received. He had a hazy idea that he was dancing and yelling with the best of them, grinning vapidly in other men's faces, and thumping their backs as hard as they thumped his. Also many other curious and unwanted motions he probably indulged in, but over these the veil of memory is mercifully opaque and very discreet. Though for the moment the astounding news he had just heard was lacking the slightest confirmatory evidence, yet the very abruptness and simplicity of the statement carried an immediate acceptance to his starved nerve centers, which long had thirsted and craved for just such a moment. He must, however, have retained a degree of control over his movements, for presently he found that he had reached the vicinity of the publishing district, which in London is so strangely compact. Enormous throngs were gathered there, waiting until they could secure a copy from the endless cataract of single sheets the vast presses were pouring forth. In the course of time, a very much torn and disgustingly dirty copy drifted into his hands. This immediately vanished into his breast pocket, and by dint of strenuous labor, he finally emerged on the outskirts of the dense jam and eventually arrived at his rooms. There he devoured every smudged and half-obliterated word. Read of the young American medico, no less or worse an American for the fact that his parents had, prior to his birth, migrated from an unspellable village in Lower Silesia, a brilliant student of bacteriology in one of the great laboratories, young Paul Steenhorst, working upon original lines of his own devising, made the discovery which saved the human species from inevitable extinction, and himself, incidentally, became the most famous man the world has ever known. There was no lack of material to experiment upon. Planes with grappling iron and hook were constantly fishing from the abominable raffle individuals which were immediately forwarded in large tanks to the now nationalized laboratories all over the country. Failure after failure had attended the efforts of the most highly specialized brains in the nation. To the rankly virulent bacilli of cholera, typhus, even plague and anthrax, these alien growths, while by no means immune, yet betrayed no greater susceptibility than the average human being in a civilized sanitary environment, and the progress of the infection would probably, in both cases, run a very similar course, a brief period of maximum vigor when the fatalities might number some 10%. There was no reason, however, to expect that even this slight measure of offense would result in more than a mere local activity, or be of the slightest practical value to the starving world. But Steenhorst, divinely inspired as many held, alighted by a devious route upon the Micrococcus phosphorans bacilli, a marine species of bacteria and the origin of the occasional phosphorescence of a few of the lesser crustacea. Unlike the bacilli of the common phosphorescence, which is harmless to its living habitation, the phosphorans produced in the blood of the victims a chemical change, which caused its rapid decease. The powers and speed of propagation of this species of bacteria bordered on the incomprehensible. Moreover, for some unknown cause, the victims of its deadly malignity were confined solely to the most insignificant order of crustacea, to which belonged the common sandhopper and its near relatives. Yet, from the first hour of its introduction to the tanks, there could be no doubt of its virulent activity in this strange nutrient medium. Its rapidity of growth and avidity of attack were astounding. In less than an hour, luminous patches could be distinctly traced in the frightful monsters, when all light was excluded from the infected tank, and in a couple of hours the whole mass of each horrible captive was glowing as though painted with a coat of phosphorus, and betraying an intense unrest, as evidenced by the violent weaving in and out of their tentacles and the incessant contracting and relaxing of their frond-like appendages. But shortly the motion had ceased, and in shapeless inert heaps they floated just below the surface, while their luminosity was now greatly increased, in spite of the fact that they had ceased to exist. A hasty microscopic examination by men whose cold fingers actually trembled as they prepared the slides revealed the complete destruction of the molecular structure of their circulating fluid by countless billions of bacilli. And even as these men of science stared at one another with a dawning comprehension of the message they had now to give to the world, even on the slides, in the tank, before their eyes commenced that astounding disintegration, a thing without parallel in experience. So rapid was the process of decay in these growths. They appeared to be falling apart and vanishing as the astonished men stared. Whole segments of tentacles became detached and fell away, and in their turn subdivided again and again, until all that could be distinguished was a vivid scarlet-hued area of sluggish liquid. For in the final stages of disintegration, some chemical reaction occurred, which tinted the putrescence a brilliant scarlet. From start to finish, the entire course of dissolution had not occupied more than 4 hours, so rapidly continuous had been its progress. That the solution of the problem had been attained, there could be little doubt. But was there yet time to save the teeming millions of Europe, now trembling on the brink of the last bottomless chasm? They could but try, and even as Batson read the bare outlines of these matters, airplanes were swarming above the horde lying just outside of New York, where the appalling nightmare of alien life had been arrested in their shoreward flow by the fresh water debouching there. Hovering and swooping like huge mosquito hawks, those voracious winged tigers of the insect world, they almost brushed that densely packed, hideous surface as they dropped the contents of many little vials upon the seething mass. It might appear to the unlearned masses, could they have witnessed the action, that it was but the play of a child straining to arrest the incoming tide with his tiny breastwork of sand. But the possessors of the far-seeing and thoughtful eyes, which scanned the enormous drift from the rear of many an airplane, knew that, upon the outcome of this silent little bombardment, depended the fate of hundreds of millions of their fellow beings. And in a few hours, these quiet, self-contained watchers knew that humanity had once again justified itself and retained the mastership of the world, had vanquished the enemy, even as our prehistoric ancestors had overcome the terrors which threatened them. For wherever the culture had been released, there shortly the movement of the growths became accelerated and troubled, and patches of phosphorescent light gleamed in the depths exposed by the upflung, flogging tentacles. Later, these spaces of agitated activity subsided, grew vague in outline, clouded, and finally developed the brilliant scarlet hue. Then, once again, these dead areas were refilled by the surrounding thousands. But the verdict had been pronounced, and again the process would be repeated, ever more rapidly, to speed on their mission the tiny messengers of death. And now, in 100 laboratories throughout the country, the deadly culture was being prepared, and roaring airplanes were rushing to them, a stream of the already infected, horrible growths. End of section 6. Section 7 of The Abysmal Horror by B. Wallis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 7. That night, Batson, 3,000 miles distant, sat drowsing and dreaming over a dirty, torn, printed sheet, sensing in his misty yet strangely accurate way the course of the operations of which he had no evidence. Drowsed and dreamed far into the night, almost unconscious of the dull roar of the millions holding high revel in every main artery of London town. An unwonted, sudden chilliness drew him from his reverie, and, rising, he moved to the wide open window and stood a little while, sniffing thoughtfully and happily at the pleasant, cool air, then muttered aloud, "I say, it's damn cool. Must be a change on the way. Thank the gods. Me for the hay and real sleep tonight." And, yawning, he abruptly closed the squeaking sash, the first time it had been moved for nearly 4 grueling, tragic weeks. Dawn, his work at the factory had turned him into an early riser, found him fanning a little fire of chips and small coal, no more than sufficient to boil a little kettle in which lay the pallid leaves of the previous day's brewing of tea. As the blaze spread its sinuous fingers amid the fuel, he suddenly realized that he had his hands spread before it with the pose of one who finds the trifling warmth grateful. Moreover, he noted that his fingers possessed a hint of that bluey tone so common in the dreary short days. "Cripes, I believe I'm cold. What the deuce is wrong?" he exclaimed in astonishment, as his gaze wandered from the fire to the window, and there it rested for a moment, for the glass was clouded with condensed moisture, evidencing the low temperature of the outside air. "Phew! What?" he ejaculated, and striding to the window, he threw up the lower sash. The window faced to the west, and no touch of the newly risen sun had fallen upon it as yet, or upon the moribund narrow box of unhealthy-looking soil which lay on the ledge. A solitary, stunted, and grim-laden geranium hibernated in this receptacle, possibly because it lacked the vitality to accomplish the feat of expiring. The leaves had drooped even lower than usual, and upon each mournful surface there lay a thin but undeniable coating of white hoarfrost. "Hell, I'm blowed! It's a frost! Who ever heard of a frost in August?" he muttered aloud, as he stretched out his hand and gently felt one of the whitened leaves. The coating instantaneously dissolved into moisture, but moisture that the Ice King had breathed upon. For a little space Batson gazed upon it, curiously watching its white virginity vanish in the rapidly warming atmosphere, and then, still pondering, returned to his miserable breakfast. And such was his reception of the earliest frost ever known in the British Isles south of the Tweed, a frost which accomplished, in a few hours, results which the entire human species had, up to its coming, failed most dismally to effect. Early in the day, strange rumors of a miraculous debacle which had overtaken the swarming terrible invaders of the land passed from one man to another. Before noon, these rumors were lifted from the category of mere sourceless hearsay to the dignity of substantiated fact. Again the huge bulletin board sent the pulse of the masses throbbing with the thrill of the news they imparted, telling of the fearful growths all over the country, now lying still and lifeless, slain in a moment by the chill breath of the phenomenal frost. Singly, in colonies, in frightful huge communities, they lay dead everywhere. There was no doubt of the fact. The news had not been made public until verified from 100 widely separated points. It was no mere local phenomenon, or even confined to the British Isles. From central France, Germany, and the great Slavonic plateau, right to the Arctic Circle, the frost, with more or less rigor, had descended. It was assumed that either these extraordinary organisms had never in their progenitors been subjected to such reduction in the temperature, or else, partaking of the nature of our annual flora at the approach of winter, their structure suffered a similar decay and dissolution, to reappear only in their descendants, having previously thrown abroad the contents of their seed containers. Possibly the temperature in their planet of origin was more stable, and the year many times the length of ours. However, the great and main fact was that the visitation had swept the country practically clear of the horrible things, though in certain protected localities a few isolated individuals might still exist. The pinnacle of the crises had been reached. On the very edge of extinction, the British people had been succored. A small percentage did, indeed, fail to survive the hardships of malnutrition and consequent depressed vitality, but, for the great majority, the encircling belt of terrible life was pierced in the nick of time. It occurred at Southampton. Here the efforts of the nation had been concentrated. For one thing, it was the logical point for the rapid handling of freight, and, for another, the narrow channel between the Isle of Wight and the mainland was alone at the entrance subjected to the inpouring of the incalculable millions of growths composing the stupendous drift. In this channel was deposited the greater part of the bacterial culture, which was rushed across the Atlantic in less than 3 days after the first cable had been received. Over 500 vessels were at the time in the English Channel, mostly anchored in certain shallow stretches, for never a breath of air had ruffled the water for the last 3 weeks. Practically all of them had left their distant home ports previous to the abrupt appearance of the frightful invasion, and by the time they reached these waters, every port within their fuel radius had been closed. In their holds they held the foodstuffs, for the lack of which millions were on the verge of extinction. Efforts had indeed been made to transfer a portion of their cargoes to land by fleets of aircraft, but the endeavor, though persisted in, was a failure to any practical extent, for the largest planes could not transport more than a few tons at a time, and it was a most difficult and lengthy business to load them, even with this trifling cargo. The great dirigibles were entirely too clumsy for the work. Therefore, the total results to date had been inappreciable. These vessels were now gathered in the vicinity of the port in readiness to make any daring move, should there prove to be the least chance of success. Men now, as in the World War, gave no heed to their lives if the great objective could be forwarded by their loss. It was an inspiring yet nerve-wracking sight for the vast crowds who were watching from the low hills and coastline which confine that channel. As far as the eye could reach, beyond the 5-mile-wide belt of heavy abomination, there were ships in lines and squadrons, south, east, and west, ships of every size and dimension, Levantine tubs of 1,000 tons or less, laden with dried fruits and 100 luxuries, mammoth American cattle and grain carriers, Australian and South American ships, filled to the hatches with scores of thousands of frozen and chilled cattle and sheep, though an increasing number of these had daily been dumped overboard as fuel ran shorter and shorter. Hardly a vessel but held in its bowels the lives of thousands of starving, desperate humanity. In 24 hours the effect of that deadly culture was plainly visible to the distant throngs. The entire channel was a strip of brilliant scarlet, and hourly it was extending to the masses adjacent. To the Glencamus Castle, 5,000-ton grain carrier of the Kincaid line, fell the honor of being the first craft to pierce that 5-mile-wide belt of horrible life. Many times it had seemed as though the attempt would be futile and the screws become fouled. But with safety valves recklessly weighted, they burst through the dying masses at the entrance to the channel and steamed into the scarlet stretch of the already dead growths. Other craft were close behind, and before the channel closed again, through the blind surge of the immense pressure from the open sea, a score of great vessels had run the gauntlet and drawn into the docks, where for days thousands of men had striven to clear the huge ridge of putrefying things which were piled 20 feet high on the wharves. And in a little the plague could be seen working among this fresh inpouring and spreading rapidly in the great belt outside. At once the news was flashed to every center of the civilized world, and the despair and chaos of the nations was changed in a moment to a delirium of elation, and aircraft by the hundred were madly driven at undreamt-of speeds, transporting the precious little packages of infection in every direction. A little later, in scores of ports, great vessels hurled their thousands of tons at full speed into the stricken things. Many found themselves surrounded by the myriads not yet affected, and were overwhelmed by them, even as those doomed ships of weeks before had been. But the individual no longer weighed in the balance when every minute was priceless. Everywhere vessels staggered through the drift, and brought life and hope to the starving millions. And everywhere the deadly little bacilli were spreading and speeding like a forest fire through the enormous mass of alien life, changing it in a few short hours to mere putrefying scum. And thus passed the most terrible menace which man so far had striven with. He triumphed, but the margin between him and total extinction had been well nigh imperceptible. As it was, before winter had set in, the phosphorans had practically completed its deadly work, and only in a few secluded islands did the marine growths linger. On land, too, it was shortly discovered that the same ally was as virulent an enemy of the terrestrial types as it was to the marine, and the remnants left by the preceding cold snap were quickly exterminated. For now the whole world was centered on this business, and nations needed neither treaties or commissions to render aid wherever it was required. Though there could be little doubt but there would be sudden outbreaks of these fearful things for many years to come, yet man had the assurance that now he had a weapon capable of overcoming the menace of this marvelous vitality and stupendous power of propagation. That such a huge volume of decay could encompass our coasts and lay the land under the blight of its fearful stench, without most serious results ensuing, was not possible. The reek of that filthy, putrefying multitude was beyond words. While in no manner similar to the stench of decay we associate with the process, yet it possessed an irritant and sickening quality many times more distressing and incredibly penetrating. There was no escaping it. It hung over the land and water as an almost visible pall, and tainted every scrap of food and drop of water with its nauseating properties. That sickness should sweep the world was inevitable, and, considering the low ebb of vitality then prevalent, it was nothing short of a miracle that the toll of life was no more. A mere 5% of the European population. On the American side the mortality was considerably less, fell a prey to what became commonly known as the green rot. That it was a hitherto unknown variety of plague was the sole explanation the masses ever assimilated. The symptoms were the appearance of greenish blotches upon the abdomen and chest. These rapidly spread, and became decomposed areas of rotting flesh, boring like ulcers into the vital organs and causing intense agony. A great variance in the susceptibility of individuals to its virulence was the most extraordinary feature of the occurrence. Many expired within a few hours, practically rotted masses of corruption. Others suffered a little space in great agony, then the symptoms abated, and in a few days the patient was as sound as ever. If one survived 24 hours, recovery was assured. No more than this fact was ever definitely agreed upon, and no antidote was discovered. However, like all human ills, this strange visitation ran its course and passed away. Winter and the ceaseless violent gales which sweep the northern seas at that season, in the course of time dispersed the slime and corruption from the water, and the great wall of death, which had encompassed thousands of miles of coastline from the Mediterranean to the Arctic, so that by the spring naught remained of all that enormous host, save the memory that time itself could never efface. It was a humbled and sobered humanity that emerged from the ordeal. The proud conceit of their vaunted progress no longer swayed the nations, and man forgot his former dream of some future day scaling the gulf which separates him from the neighboring heavenly bodies. Rather was there a dread that the inhabitants of these worlds might again, through a similar mischance, leap that gulf and arrive to wreak their merciless will upon our planet. The old order of assured dominance and pride of the stability and security of the species had been shattered, and humanity became more reverent and humble. The antagonisms of race, so fiercely maintained in former days, were largely obliterated by the realization that, faced by a common foe, boundary lines and commercial jealousies had, in a twinkling, vanished, and mankind awoke to the fact that north, south, east, and west, the human race was but a single family, isolated in the immensity of creation. A truer sense of proportion came to the world, and the insanity of slaying one's neighbor, who might well tomorrow be one's salvation, was borne upon all men. Not that bickerings or wars ceased, but anger was neither so hasty or prolonged, and the intense bitterness toward an opponent, which had previously swept the entire world into a mad carnival of murder, was now an impossibility. As in the mass, so in the individual, the mental outlook had undergone a radical change. One likes to think of Batson deserting his desk and invertebrate existence for the whir of a cyclopean lathe, which daily in his hands gave to the world a lasting monument of the fact that once a living man had fulfilled the object of his being and left his fellows the richer for his presence. End of section 7. End of The Abysmal Horror by B. Wallis.